The temple burned. Cassia ran through the smoke-choked halls, her bare feet slapping against the marble floor. Statues of the gods loomed overhead, their faces cracked by the heat, their silent eyes watching as fire consumed the world they had abandoned. Screams echoed from the courtyard, where the temple guards fought a battle they could not win. The scent of blood and burning oil thickened the air. Somewhere beyond the flames, the cultists chanted their hymn of destruction. "The gods have fallen," their voices roared. "The age of prophecy ends tonight." Cassia clutched the scroll to her chest, her breath ragged. The vision still burned behind her eyes. The great empire crumbling into war. The gods' names erased from stone. The devourer rising from the depths to feast upon fate itself. The prophecy could not die here. She staggered down a hidden passage, one only the oracles knew. A door loomed ahead, old wood reinforced with bronze, leading to the sacred pool where the gods once whispered their secrets. If she could reach it, if she could call to them one last time. A shadow stepped into her path. Tall, cloaked in darkness, the man wore no armor, no emblem of loyalty. But she knew him. Kalis, the high priest turned heretic, the leader of the Sons of the Veil. Cassia took a step back, her heart hammering. "The age of oracles is over," Kalis said, his voice like rusted iron. "You are the last, and you will die with them." His dagger flashed in the firelight. Cassia had no weapon, no warrior's strength, but she had something else. The gods' final gift. She closed her eyes and whispered the ancient words. And as Kalis lunged, the world shattered around her. Cassia woke to silence. She lay on cold stone, her body aching. The scent of smoke filled the air, and the temple, her home, was nothing but ruins. The great marble pillars had fallen, the sacred statues were broken, and the once bright fires of the altar had turned to ash. She sat up slowly, pressing a hand to her head. Her vision swam, but she forced herself to focus. She was alive. The gods had spared her. But why? Then she remembered. Kalis. He had tried to kill her. He had destroyed the temple. His followers, the Sons of the Veil, had wanted to end the age of prophecy, and now it seemed they had succeeded. Cassia's hands tightened around the scroll she had saved. It was the last prophecy, the final message from the gods. She had seen the future, a great empire in flames, terrible darkness rising, the gods forgotten. She could not let that happen. Taking a deep breath, she stood. The city below the temple was quiet, but she knew that peace was a lie. If Kalis and his men had attacked the temple, they would not stop there. She had to run. She had to find someone who would believe her. And most of all, she had to survive. Cassia moved through the dark streets, her hood pulled low. The city of Avaris, once the heart of the empire, felt different now. The air was heavy with fear. People whispered in the alleys. Doors shut quickly as she passed. She needed to find Lord Darius. He was a general, a man who still followed the old ways. If anyone would listen to her warning, it was him. But she was being watched. She felt the weight of unseen eyes, the shadow that moved when she turned a corner. The Sons of the Veil were hunting her. Cassia quickened her pace. The streets twisted in endless paths, but she knew them well. She had played here as a child before she had been taken to the temple. She knew where to hide. A sudden hand grabbed her wrist. She gasped, reaching for a dagger she did not have. "Quiet," a voice whispered. She turned and saw a man in a worn cloak. His face was sharp, his eyes filled with urgency. "I know who you are," he said, "and if you want to live, you must come with me, now." Cassia hesitated. Trust was dangerous, but she had no choice. Footsteps echoed behind her. She followed the stranger into the night. The stranger led Cassia through a maze of alleyways, moving quickly and without hesitation. Cassia's heart pounded. Every instinct told her to turn and run, but she had no other options. Finally, they reached a small, abandoned shrine at the edge of the city. The man pushed open the heavy wooden door and gestured for her to enter. Cassia hesitated. A trap? A mistake? But the sound of boots striking stones behind them chose for her. She stepped inside. The stranger shut the door and pressed his ear against it, listening. Silence. Then he turned to her. "You're lucky I found you first," he said. Cassia studied him. His clothes were simple, but his posture was that of a warrior. He moved like a man who had seen battle. "Who are you?" she asked. "My name is Julius," he said, "and you are Cassia, the last oracle." The title sent a shiver down her spine. She had never wanted to be the last of anything. Julius crossed his arms. "The sons of the Vale are everywhere. They won't stop hunting you until you're dead." Cassia swallowed. She already knew that. "Why do you care?" Julius's jaw tightened. "Because Kalis betrayed me too. He thinks he can erase the past, kill the gods, and build his empire. I won't let that happen." Cassia narrowed her eyes. "You were one of them." "I was," he admitted, "but not anymore." She didn't trust him, but she didn't have a choice. "You want to stop Kalis?" she asked. Julius nodded. "Then take me to Lord Darius. He's the only one with an army strong enough to fight back." Julius sighed. "That's not as easy as you think." Cassia's stomach tightened. "Why?" "Because Darius is in chains," Julius said. "And if we want his help, we have to break him out of prison." The prison stood at the heart of the city, a massive fortress carved into the cliffs. It was said that no one had ever escaped. Cassia and Julius watched from a rooftop, hidden beneath the cover of night. "The Sons of the Vale control the prison," Julius whispered. "They'll be expecting someone to try and free Darius. We won't get a second chance." Cassia's mind raced. She had never broken into a prison before, but she had read the prophecies. She knew that Darius still had a role to play. She just had to make sure he lived long enough to fulfill it. "Then we'll have to be clever," she said. Julius grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." The last oracle had made her choice, and there was no turning back. Cassia and Julius moved through the city like shadows. The fortress loomed before them, its stone walls lit by torches and guarded by heavily armed soldiers. "The front gate is impossible," Julius whispered. "Too many guards." Cassia nodded. "Then we go in another way." Julius glanced at her. "You have a plan?" She pointed to the western side of the fortress. "The underground aqueducts. The prison gets its water from the river outside the city. If we can follow the tunnels, we might find a way inside." Julius grinned. "You are an oracle." They made their way to the river, where ancient stone tunnels fed water into the fortress. The entrance was half submerged, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. "This is going to be unpleasant," Julius muttered. Cassia took a deep breath. "Let's go." The tunnels were dark and damp, the air thick with the scent of moss and rot. Cassia and Julius moved carefully, listening for any signs of danger. As they crawled deeper, the walls narrowed and the water rose to their waists. Julius led the way, feeling along the stone for any hidden passages. Then he stopped. "Here," he whispered. Cassia felt it too, a break in the wall. Julius pressed against it, and with a soft click, a section of stone slid open, revealing a hidden passageway. "How did you know?" she asked. Julius smirked. "Because I helped design it." Cassia's eyes widened, but there was no time for questions. They stepped inside, sealing the entrance behind them. They had entered the silent fortress. The passage led them to a lower level of the prison, where the air was thick with the scent of sweat and blood. Chains rattled in the darkness, and muffled voices echoed through the stone corridors. Julius pulled Cassia into the shadows as a pair of guards walked past. When they were gone, he motioned for her to follow. They moved quickly, past rows of iron-barred cells. Most of the prisoners were too weak to notice them. But then a deep voice rumbled from the darkness. "I was wondering when someone would come." Cassia turned. Behind the bars stood a man built like a war god. His dark hair was streaked with silver, his face lined with the scars of 100 battles. Despite his chains, he carried himself like a king, Lord Darius. Cassia stepped forward. "We're here to free you." Darius smiled grimly. "Then you'd better hurry, because they know you're here." An alarm bell rang through the fortress. Cassia's heart pounded as the alarm bells rang through the fortress. Heavy boots thundered above them. Soldiers were coming. Julius cursed under his breath and rushed to the cell door. "The keys," he muttered, searching the nearby walls. "There has to be." "No time." Darius gripped the iron bars and pulled. His muscles tensed, and with a deep growl, he ripped the rusted door from its hinges. The metal screeched as it gave way. Julius stared. "Remind me never to fight you." "No arguments here," Cassius said. "Let's move." Darius stepped out, rolling his shoulders. "Weapons?" Julius handed him a stolen sword from a nearby rack. "Not your usual, but it'll do." Darius tested the weight, then nodded. "Good enough." Heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. Soldiers were closing in. Cassia grabbed Julius's arm. "Which way?" Julius pointed left. "The old servants' passage. It leads to the upper halls. From there, we get to the eastern wall and climb down." Darius frowned. "They'll have archers on the walls." "I'll handle them," Cassia said firmly. Darius looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Let's go." They ran through the stone corridors, passing empty cells and torches flickering in the damp air. The alarm bell rang louder, and shouts filled the halls. Then an iron gate slammed down in front of them. From the other side, a captain in golden armor stood, smirking. "Going somewhere?" he sneered, raising his sword. Behind him, more soldiers gathered, their weapons drawn. Darius stepped forward. "Stand aside!" The captain laughed. "You're in chains, Darius. You have no army, no throne, and no hope." Darius grinned. "Chains don't make a man weak." Then he attacked. Darius moved like a storm, his stolen blade flashing as he struck. The first soldier barely had time to raise his shield before Darius's sword shattered it. He fell with a cry, and the others hesitated. Julius leaped into the fight, moving quickly, his daggers finding gaps in the enemy's armor. Cassia, her heart steady, raised her hands. The air around her shimmered. The captain turned to her, eyes widening. "Which?" A blast of golden light shot from her palm, sending him crashing into the gate with a deafening clang. The soldiers hesitated, their fear clear in their wide eyes. The golden light still crackled around Cassia's fingers, illuminating the dim corridor like sunlight breaking through a storm. "Do you fear the god's power?" she demanded, stepping forward. "Then run." For a moment, none of them moved. Then one soldier turned and fled. Another followed. Soon, only the captain remained, groaning as he pushed himself up from where he had been thrown against the gate. Cassia advanced, her hands still glowing. "You were saying?" The captain gritted his teeth, glaring at her. "This is not over, Oracle." "No," she agreed, her voice cold. "It isn't." With a flick of her wrist, she sent a final pulse of golden energy toward him. The force knocked him unconscious. Darius let out a breath. "Remind me not to make you angry." Julius smirked. "You'd be wise to remember that." Cassia ignored them and turned to the iron gate. It was locked tight, but she knew the old fortress well. She placed her hands on the metal and closed her eyes. A soft hum filled the air. The iron shimmered, growing hotter until it groaned and twisted. With a loud snap, the lock melted away, and the gate swung open. Julius whistled. "Convenient." Cassia didn't respond. The use of her power left her feeling drained, but there was no time to rest. She stepped through the gate. "Come on, we're close." They ran through the corridors, their footsteps echoing against the stone. The air smelled of burning oil and damp earth. The fortress was waking up to their escape. Shouts rang from above, and the sound of boots pounded on staircases. By the time they reached the eastern wall, archers were already lining up on the battlements. "There!" Julius pointed to a coil of rope left hanging from an old siege hook. We can climb down. Darius grabbed the rope and gave it a strong tug. It'll hold. Julius went first, descending swiftly down the outer wall. Cassia followed her hands firm despite her trembling exhaustion. Arrows rained down from above. Darius, still at the top, ripped a shield from a fallen soldier and used it to deflect the arrows as he climbed. Then a horn sounded in the distance, a deep, echoing note that sent a chill down Cassia's spine. She turned her head just in time to see the fortress gates bursting open. More soldiers, more reinforcements, and leading them a figure in dark robes, standing still as stone, watching her with cold, knowing eyes. Her breath caught in her throat. No, it couldn't be. But she knew who he was. The high priest of the Sun Temple, the man who had taken the oracles, the man who had sworn to hunt her until the end of the world. His voice carried over the battlefield like a curse. Cassia of Delos. She froze on the rope, her heart hammering. Cassia's grip tightened on the rope. The high priest stood at the fortress gates, his dark robes billowing in the wind, his face calm, unreadable. But his voice was filled with certainty. I see you. It was more than a declaration. It was a promise. Darius landed beside her, drawing his sword. We need to move, now. Julius grabbed her arm. Cassia, go! The sound of galloping hooves echoed in the valley. The high priest wasn't alone. A company of elite warriors rode out from the fortress, their golden armor gleaming in the moonlight. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were the Sun Guard, the high priest's enforcers, fanatics trained to hunt and kill in the name of the gods. Cassia forced herself to breathe. They had come too far to stop now. She tore her gaze away from the high priest and ran. They sprinted into the trees just as the first arrows struck the ground behind them. The Sun Guard followed fast, their horses thundering through the valley. Julius, the cliffs! Cassia shouted. He understood immediately. This way! They wove through the dense forest, ducking under branches and leaping over roots. The Sun Guard were gaining ground, but the riders would not be able to follow them to the cliffs, not without risking a deadly fall. The trees thinned, the land sloped downward. Then open sky. The cliffs loomed ahead, jagged rocks dropping into a dark abyss. The river below roared, its currents deadly and wild. Cassia turned to Julius. Do you trust me? His eyes widened. Cassia, no! But there was no time. The Sun Guard was nearly upon them. Cassia grabbed Julius's hand. Then without hesitation, she jumped. The wind howled in her ears. The world spun. For a moment, there was nothing but weightlessness. Then, impact. The icy water swallowed her whole. Cassia fought against the current, her body screaming in pain. She kicked, reaching for the surface. Somewhere beside her, Julius surfaced with a gasp. Darius hit the water a second later, roaring in shock. By the gods! Cassia barely had time to respond before the river pulled them under again. The force of the water dragged them through the rocky channel, twisting and churning. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then, hands, strong hands grabbed her, pulling her from the river's grasp. She collapsed onto solid ground, coughing, gasping for air. Julius flopped beside her, groaning. Never! He coughed. Never do that again. Darius staggered onto the shore, shaking water from his hair. Remind me why we let you lead. Cassia ignored them, turning her gaze up toward the cliffs. The Sun Guard stood at the edge, their golden armor gleaming in the moonlight. The high priest watched from his saddle, his expression unreadable. Cassia shivered. Cassia's breath came in ragged gasps as she stared up at the high priest and his Sun Guard. They did not descend the cliffs, nor did they call out in anger. They simply watched. A shiver ran down her spine. Darius wiped water from his face. They're not following. They don't have to, Julius muttered, sitting up. They know we won't get far. Cassia clenched her fists. He was right. The river had carried them far from the fortress, but they were exhausted, soaked, and stranded in the wilderness. And the high priest, he would not let them go so easily. We need to move. Cassia pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the ache in her limbs. The sun guard will find another way down. Darius groaned. You just jumped off a cliff and you want to run again? Cassia shot him a look. Would you rather wait here to die? He sighed. Fair point. They pushed forward, the dense forest swallowing them whole. Hours passed as they moved through the undergrowth. The moon cast eerie shadows through the trees, and the only sound was the distant rush of the river. Cassia walked ahead, her senses sharp. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig made her tense. The high priest had marked her. She knew it. Wherever she went, his gaze would follow. Julius stepped beside her. Where are we going? Cassia hesitated. North, to the ruins. Darius groaned. The ruins? You mean the cursed temple that no one dares to enter? Cassia ignored his complaint. The temple is older than the high priest, older than the sun guard. If there's any place left where the gods still whisper, it's there. Julius's expression darkened. And if the gods are silent? Cassia didn't answer. Because she already knew. If the gods were silent, there would be no salvation. No prophecy. Only death. By dawn, they reached the ruins. The temple was crumbling, swallowed by vines and time. Massive stone pillars stood half buried in the earth, etched with ancient symbols of forgotten deities. Cassia stepped forward, her heart pounding. This was where it had begun, where the first oracles had spoken, where the gods had once whispered their will. And now, silence. Darius glanced around uneasily. I hate this place. Julius touched one of the carvings. Do you think the gods will answer here? Cassia inhaled deeply, then placed her hands on the stone. A spark shot through her fingertips. She gasped, stumbling backwards. The air trembled. A low hum filled the temple, the ancient carvings glowing with an eerie light. Julius stepped back. Cassia? Then a voice. Not a whisper, not a prayer, but a command. You have been found. The ground trembled, the sky darkened, and from the shadows of the ruins, something stirred. Cassia's breath caught in her throat. The carvings burned with golden light, the air thick with unseen power. The voice had spoken, clear, undeniable. You have been found. Darius grabbed her arm. What was that? Cassia swallowed hard. The gods! Julius stepped closer, his eyes scanning the ruins. Or something pretending to be them. The ground shuddered again, and from the darkness between the fallen pillars, figures emerged. At first, they seemed like shadows, barely distinguishable from the ruins. But as they stepped into the light, Cassia saw them. They were robed in tattered garments of gold and white, their faces hidden beneath ancient masks. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as if they had been waiting for centuries. One of them, taller than the rest, raised a hand. The golden light in the carvings pulsed. You are the oracle. The voice was neither male nor female, but deep, echoing with power. Cassia straightened. Who are you? The figure tilted its head. We are the Watchers, keepers of the last prophecy. We have waited for the one who would come. Darius shifted uncomfortably. That sounds concerning. Julius narrowed his eyes. What prophecy? The Watcher ignored him and turned back to Cassia. The gods have been silent for too long, but their will remains. The air around them felt heavy, charged with something ancient and unseen. Cassia's fingers curled into fists. And what is their will? She asked. The Watcher took a step closer. To restore the balance. The ground trembled harder. The ruins groaned, as if something beneath them was stirring. The sky, once pale with morning light, darkened once more. Cassia's heart pounded. The balance of what? She whispered. The Watcher reached out and placed a single cold hand against her forehead. And suddenly she saw. What will happen if actions are not taken? The world will burn and get destroyed. Darius has had enough. Darius rode hard for the mountain pass where his army had made camp. The wind howled around him, carrying the weight of the battle to come. He had sent word ahead. The oracle had been found, and war was inevitable. By the time he reached the camp, the soldiers were already preparing. Fires burned bright, swords were sharpened, and armor was strapped into place. Cassia and Julius arrived shortly after him. Cassia pulled her hood low, but she could feel the eyes of the soldiers on her. They had heard the whispers. The oracle was real. The gods had not abandoned them. Darius climbed onto a wooden platform, his voice rising above the clamor. "The sun guard is coming," he called. "The high priest marches to destroy us. He thinks we are weak. He thinks we will kneel." The men growled in response, gripping their weapons tighter. "But we are warriors, and we will not fall to the will of tyrants." A roar of approval erupted through the camp. Julius stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the army. "We need to hold the pass," he said. "If they break through, they will burn everything in their path." Darius nodded. "Then we make our stand here." Cassia looked at the faces of the men before her, fighters, mercenaries, soldiers who had abandoned their oaths to the high priest. They were not the sun guard, but they were strong. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I am the oracle," she said, her voice steady, "and I will stand with you." The wind stirred, the golden light flickering in her eyes. The sun had barely risen when the sun guard arrived. Thousands of soldiers, dressed in golden armor, banners bearing the sigil of the high priest snapping in the wind. They stood in perfect formation, their discipline unmatched. At the front of the army, on a black war horse, sat the high priest general, Severus Kale, a ruthless commander, loyal only to the gods, or what remained of them. He raised his sword. "Burn the heretics!" The sun guards surged forward like a golden tide. Darius's soldiers held their ground. Arrows rained from the cliffs, cutting into the enemy ranks. Shield walls clashed, swords met flesh, and the mountain pass turned red with blood. Cassia stood at the heart of it all. The power inside her pulsed, begging to be released. She closed her eyes and let it. A wave of golden energy erupted from her, knocking back the sun guard like leaves in the wind. The earth trembled beneath her feet. The oracle had awakened. Cassia's power surged through the battlefield like a storm. The golden energy sent shockwaves through the sun guard's ranks, throwing soldiers to the ground and shattering their perfect formation. Darius and Julius seized the moment. "Push forward!" Darius roared, raising his sword high. His warriors charged, cutting through the disoriented enemy. The sun guard, once feared as the strongest force in the land, now faltered. Without their disciplined formation, they were vulnerable. Julius fought like a man possessed, his blade striking with deadly precision. Darius fought beside him, his armor slick with blood, his war cry echoing through the pass. Cassia, standing at the center of the chaos, lifted her hands once more. Her golden eyes glowed as she summoned the last of her strength. A final blast of power erupted from her, blinding and unstoppable. The remaining sun guard crumbled under the force, their weapons torn from their hands, their bodies thrown to the ground. Severus Kale, the enemy general, fell to his knees. His sword clattered beside him. He looked up at Cassia, his face twisted in disbelief. "The gods have abandoned us," he whispered. Cassia stepped forward, her voice calm but unyielding. "No," she said, "only the false gods." With that, the battle was won. News of the sun guard's defeat spread like wildfire. Villages that once feared the high priest now turned against him. Cities opened their gates, welcoming Darius and his army as liberators. Cassia, the last oracle, had been revealed, and the people rejoiced. As they marched toward the empire's capital, their forces grew. Soldiers who had once served the high priest abandoned their posts. Farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants took up arms. The streets of the capital were lined with people when they arrived. They did not resist, they did not fight, they cheered. The golden banners of the high priest were torn down. The temples that had once demanded blind obedience were abandoned. Cassia stood before the grand palace, once the seat of power for the tyrants who had ruled for generations. It was time to end it. The high priest knelt before them, his golden robes stained with dust. His guards had fled. His empire had crumbled. Cassia looked down at him, her expression unreadable. "You built your kingdom on lies," she said. "You used the name of the gods to keep people in chains." The old man trembled, his lips moving in silent prayer. But no god answered him. Darius stepped forward. "The oracle has returned. The people are free. Your rule is over." The high priest was taken away. His rule ended without bloodshed. For the first time in centuries, the empire belonged to its people. Cassia walked up the steps of the great temple, the sacred place where the first oracle had once stood. The golden light returned to the city, filling the halls with warmth. She turned to the crowd below, her voice strong. "I am the oracle," she declared, "and the age of truth begins today." The people cheered. The war was over, the world was saved, and the oracle had been restored. A new era had begun. Please subscribe, like, and click the notification button for more of this stories.